The gorilla didn't move when his keeper was fired. That was the part that terrified everyone. At exactly 9:14 on a cloudy Thursday morning, visitors at the Westbrook Wildlife Center watched in confusion as Daniel Brooks carried a small cardboard box through the employee gate with two security guards walking behind him. Nobody was yelling. Nobody was fighting. The zoo's loudspeakers continued playing cheerful music for families near the food court, and children kept pressing quarters into the souvenir machines just a few hundred feet away. But inside Gorilla Habitat 3, a 700-pound silverback named Bruno sat completely still on top of a concrete platform, staring directly at Daniel without blinking once. "Why isn't he reacting?" one of the staff members whispered nervously. Usually, Bruno noticed everything. If a leaf blew into the enclosure, he looked up. If a child laughed too loudly near the glass, he turned immediately. The gorilla was famous among regular visitors for how alert he was. But now he looked frozen, almost human, his dark eyes locked onto the man who had raised him since infancy. Daniel stopped walking for a second near the outer fence. Even from 30 yards away, Bruno could clearly see the small framed photograph sticking out of the box in Daniel's hands. It was an old picture of them together from years ago, back when Bruno was barely bigger than a Labrador retriever. One of the guards quietly told Daniel to keep moving. Daniel nodded and lowered his head. He never got to say goodbye. The strange part started exactly 12 seconds later. Bruno slowly stood up, walked to the center of the enclosure, and turned his back toward the crowd. Then he pressed one massive hand flat against the glass wall and stayed there without moving. Visitors immediately began filming with their phones. "That's creepy," a teenage boy muttered nearby. Another woman nervously pulled her daughter closer. For nearly 3 full minutes, Bruno remained in that exact position. No pounding, no roaring, no aggression, just silence. The kind of silence that makes people uncomfortable without understanding why. Then zoo employee Olivia Turner arrived carrying Bruno's breakfast tray. She froze the moment she saw him. "Bruno," she called softly. The gorilla didn't respond. Olivia glanced toward the empty walkway where Daniel had disappeared. "He knows," she whispered under her breath. A low, uneasy murmur spread among the staff standing nearby. Everyone at Westbrook knew Bruno and Daniel were unusually close. Daniel talked to the gorilla constantly during feedings, maintenance, and training sessions. Some employees joked that Bruno listened to Daniel more carefully than most people listened to their own families. But nobody expected this. Olivia carefully slid the food tray through the feeding hatch. Fresh fruit, lettuce, peanut snacks, and warm oatmeal. Bruno's favorites. The gorilla didn't even look at it. That had never happened before. 20 minutes passed. The food remained untouched. By noon, Bruno still hadn't moved from the glass. Families began avoiding the enclosure entirely. Something about the gorilla felt wrong now. Not angry, not wild. Worse, focused. At 1:37 p.m., a little boy pressed his hands against the visitor glass and innocently asked his mother, "Why does the monkey look sad?" Before she could answer, Bruno suddenly lifted his head toward the zoo's administration building across the courtyard. His nostrils flared once. Then, for the first time all day, he showed his teeth. Not in rage, not in warning. It looked almost like fear. Olivia noticed it immediately. "Wait," she said quietly, stepping closer to the glass. Bruno began pacing in slow circles. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he stopped directly in front of Olivia and slammed both fists against the glass so hard the entire wall shook. Children screamed. Staff members jumped backward. And then Bruno did something no one at Westbrook Wildlife Center had ever seen before. He pointed directly toward the employee parking lot, where Daniel's old truck was still sitting alone. The employee parking lot sat almost empty under the gray afternoon sky, while nervous staff members stared at Bruno through the thick glass walls of Habitat 3. The giant silverback had not touched his food for over 6 hours. The oatmeal had gone cold. Fruit flies buzzed around. Sliced bananas and strawberries that normally would have disappeared in minutes. But Bruno remained near the viewing window, breathing slowly, his dark eyes fixed on Daniel's old blue pickup truck parked beyond the maintenance gate. Olivia Turner stood quietly beside the enclosure with her arms folded tightly against her chest. She had worked at Westbrook Wildlife Center for almost 4 years, and in all that time, she had never seen Bruno ignore food. Not once. Even during thunderstorms or construction noise, the gorilla always ate. Daniel used to joke that Bruno could smell peanut butter from a football field away. But now the silverback looked hollow somehow, as if something inside him had shut down the moment Daniel walked away. Maybe he is confused, one of the younger handlers whispered. Olivia slowly shook her head. No, she answered softly. He understands exactly what happened. The words sent a chill through the group, standing nearby. Most visitors only saw Bruno as a powerful attraction behind reinforced glass, but the staff knew how unusual he really was. Daniel had raised him since Bruno was 2 years old after wildlife officers rescued the young gorilla from an illegal animal trafficking operation near the port of Miami. At the time, Bruno had been severely underweight, terrified of people, and too anxious to sleep alone. For months, Daniel stayed late every night sitting beside the enclosure reading books out loud just so the frightened young gorilla would stop trembling whenever lights turned off. Nobody at the zoo expected the bond between them to last this long. Yet somehow, 18 years later, Bruno still followed Daniel with his eyes every time he entered the habitat. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., Daniel whistled twice before unlocking the keeper door, and Bruno always responded with the same low rumbling sound from across the enclosure. Visitors loved it because it felt almost like watching two old friends greeting each other after years apart, instead of a man feeding a wild animal. Olivia remembered one winter morning when the heating system temporarily failed during a snowstorm. While maintenance crews rushed to fix the problem, Daniel stayed inside the indoor habitat for nearly 4 straight hours, just talking calmly to Bruno while the gorilla sat beside him listening quietly. He trusts your voice more than anything, Olivia had told Daniel afterward. Daniel only smiled sadly and replied, sometimes trust is all they have. Standing there now beside the untouched food tray, Olivia suddenly realized how quiet the enclosure felt without Daniel's voice echoing through the concrete halls. Even the visitors seemed uncomfortable. Parents pulled children away faster than usual. Conversations stayed hushed. Bruno had stopped pacing completely and now sat near the glass holding one arm across his chest while staring toward the parking lot. The huge gorilla looked less like an animal and more like someone waiting for terrible news they already knew was coming. Around 5:20 p.m., the zoo officially closed for the evening. The crowds disappeared. Gift shop lights shut off one by one across the property. Rain began tapping softly against the enclosure windows while the remaining staff prepared for night procedures. Olivia returned carrying a fresh blanket because Bruno always liked arranging it himself before sleeping. Usually, he carefully folded the edges into a corner nest every evening before lying down. Tonight, he did not even look at it. Instead, Bruno slowly approached the glass again and lowered himself onto his knuckles directly in front of Olivia. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the silverback quietly lifted one massive finger and touched the exact spot on the glass where Daniel used to place his hand every morning before work. Olivia felt her throat tighten instantly. But before she could speak, Bruno suddenly turned his head toward the dark hallway leading to the restricted service tunnels beneath the zoo. His entire body became still, and somewhere deep below the building, a metal door slammed shut. The sound of the metal door slamming somewhere beneath the zoo echoed through the service corridor long after midnight. But when Olivia rushed downstairs with 2 maintenance workers, they found nothing except flickering fluorescent lights and an empty concrete hallway that smelled faintly of rainwater and machine oil. One of the workers nervously laughed and blamed the noise on old pipes shifting during the storm, yet Olivia could not stop thinking about Bruno's reaction upstairs. The silverback had not merely heard the sound. He had anticipated it. By the time she returned to Habitat 3, Bruno was no longer sitting near the glass. Instead, the enormous gorilla had dragged his blanket across the enclosure and spread it directly in front of the keeper access door Daniel used every morning. The behavior immediately unsettled Olivia because Bruno never moved objects randomly. Every enrichment toy, every feeding bucket, every blanket inside the habitat was usually arranged carefully in the same predictable spots. Daniel once said Bruno hated disorder. But tonight the silverback had created what almost looked like a barrier across the entrance. Olivia slowly approached the observation window again. Bruno, she called gently. The gorilla did not respond. He sat beside the blanket with both hands resting on the floor and stared at the dark hallway beyond the keeper door without blinking. At 2:13 a.m., the The overnight security cameras recorded something even stranger. Bruno suddenly stood up, walked to the far corner of the habitat, and began gathering loose straw into small piles across the concrete floor. One pile near the water basin, another near the indoor climbing wall, another directly under the emergency sprinkler system. The night guard watching the monitors frowned in confusion. "What is he doing?" he muttered quietly. For nearly 40 minutes, Bruno continued moving objects around the enclosure with eerie precision. He stacked empty feeding bowls beside the keeper gate. He shoved rubber enrichment balls against the drainage grates. At one point, he even dragged a heavy plastic barrel nearly 20 feet before positioning it directly beneath the security camera mounted above the door. Then he climbed onto the barrel, reached upward slowly, and touched the camera lens with the tips of his fingers. The overnight guard felt a chill crawl up his arms. "That is not normal," he whispered. By sunrise, rumors had already spread among the staff. Some employees believed Bruno was becoming unstable after Daniel's firing. Others quietly wondered if the gorilla was trying to communicate something. But nobody could explain the growing pattern of strange behavior. When the zoo reopened at 9 a.m., Bruno ignored the crowds completely. Children pressed against the glass hoping to see the famous silverback beat his chest or interact with visitors, but Bruno barely acknowledged anyone. Instead, he spent hours walking the exact same route around the enclosure in complete silence. 6 slow steps forward. Pause. Turn. 6 slow steps back. Again and again. Olivia eventually realized the route formed a straight line between the keeper door and the outdoor fence facing the employee parking lot. It looked almost like Bruno was measuring distance. Around lunchtime, a maintenance supervisor entered the indoor service hallway carrying a toolbox. The moment his boots touched the concrete near the keeper entrance, Bruno reacted instantly. The gorilla spun around so fast several visitors screamed. But instead of charging the glass or roaring, Bruno rushed toward the far side of the habitat and slammed both hands against the emergency exit panel mounted on the wall. Alarms immediately flashed red across the control room monitors. "He knows where the emergency systems are?" the supervisor asked in disbelief. Olivia did not answer, because deep down, she remembered something Daniel once admitted months earlier during a late-night conversation in the veterinary wing. He had quietly confessed that Bruno paid attention to everything humans did inside the habitat. Locks, buttons, radios, light switches. Daniel used to laugh about it like a harmless joke. But standing there now, watching the giant silverback repeatedly strike the emergency panel while staring directly at the underground service corridor, Olivia suddenly did not find it funny anymore. Then, without warning, Bruno stopped moving completely. The entire enclosure became silent. Slowly, the gorilla reached beneath the blanket near the keeper door and pulled out a small object no one had noticed before. It was Daniel's employee badge. The moment Olivia saw Daniel's employee badge in Bruno's hand, the atmosphere inside Westbrook Wildlife Center changed completely. What had felt strange before now felt dangerous. Within minutes, 3 senior staff members crowded into the security office replaying footage from every camera surrounding Habitat 3. Director Marcus Hayes stood stiffly beside the monitors with his jaw clenched tight, while Bruno's image flickered across the screens again and again. The silverback, carefully hiding Daniel's badge beneath the blanket, unsettled everyone far more than shouting or aggression would have. "How long has he had that?" one supervisor whispered nervously. Nobody knew. Daniel's badge was supposed to be returned immediately after termination. Yet somehow Bruno had gotten it before Daniel left the property. Hayes folded his arms and stared coldly at the screen. "This is exactly what I warned everyone about," he muttered. Olivia looked over sharply. "What does that mean?" she asked. Hayes sighed heavily, as if exhausted by the entire situation. "It means Daniel blurred boundaries for years," he replied. "Now the animal is emotionally dependent and unpredictable." Olivia wanted to argue, but deep down she knew the director's words would sound reasonable to the board members. Bruno was not behaving like any gorilla they had documented before. He was organizing objects, reacting to employee movement patterns, and somehow keeping track of Daniel's belongings. To outsiders, it would not look emotional. It would look unstable. Throughout the afternoon, Bruno's behavior only made things worse. He refused every attempt at enrichment activities. He ignored the trainers. He repeatedly positioned himself between staff members and the underground service hallway connected to the maintenance tunnels beneath the zoo. At one point, when a janitor pushed a supply cart too close to the corridor entrance, Bruno suddenly let out a deep explosive bark that echoed through the entire habitat building. Visitors screamed and rushed backward from the glass. A little girl started crying. Security immediately cleared the viewing area while Bruno paced rapidly near the keeper door, dragging Daniel's badge tightly against his chest. "This cannot continue," Hayes said firmly during the emergency staff meeting that evening. Rain hammered against the conference room windows while exhausted employees sat silently around the table. Olivia could feel tension tightening every face in the room. Nobody wanted to say it aloud, but everyone was thinking the same thing now. Bruno might no longer be safe around people. "He is escalating," one board member said quietly over speakerphone. "The public already noticed something is wrong." Another voice added, "Social media videos from today have over 2 million views already." Olivia clenched her hands beneath the table. "He is grieving," she said carefully. "That does not make him dangerous." Hayes turned toward her slowly. "Olivia, grieving animals do not disable emergency panels and hoard employee property." His voice stayed calm, which somehow made it worse. "The board is concerned Daniel conditioned Bruno to rely on him in unhealthy ways." Olivia immediately shook her head. "Daniel loved that gorilla." "Exactly," Hayes replied sharply. "Too much." Silence swallowed the room. Outside, thunder rolled low across the dark sky. Finally, Hayes slid a folder across the table toward the veterinary staff. "The board approved a temporary behavioral transfer," he announced. Olivia felt her stomach drop instantly. She opened the folder and saw transport documents stamped with another facility's logo nearly 3 states away. Specialized Primate Behavioral Research Center. Transfer scheduled within 48 hours. "No," Olivia said immediately. "You cannot move him right now." Hayes did not even blink. "We cannot risk an incident with the public." "He is terrified," Olivia argued. "Moving him now will make everything worse." But Hayes had already made up his mind. At sunrise tomorrow, Bruno will be sedated for evaluation and transport preparation. The room fell silent again. Olivia stared at the papers in disbelief while rainwater streamed down the conference room windows behind her. Across the zoo, Bruno sat alone in the dark enclosure clutching Daniel's employee badge against his chest like the last thing he had left in the world. Then, at exactly 11:42 p.m., one of the security monitors suddenly lost signal near the underground service tunnel beneath Habitat 3. The security monitor near the underground tunnel remained black for exactly 17 seconds before flickering back online, but those 17 seconds stayed trapped in Olivia's mind long after the rest of the staff dismissed it as another electrical issue caused by the storm. Westbrook Wildlife Center was old. Cameras failed sometimes. Doors jammed. Lights flickered. Everyone kept repeating those explanations the next morning while transport preparations for Bruno quietly moved forward behind the scenes. Yet Olivia could not shake the feeling that something underneath the zoo was deeply wrong. At 6:30 a.m., she arrived early at Habitat 3 carrying Bruno's medication chart and morning supplements. The sky outside still looked dark blue from the passing storm, and the empty zoo pathways glistened with rainwater under the security lamps. Usually, Bruno reacted the moment he heard approaching footsteps in the service corridor. This morning there was no movement at all. Olivia's chest tightened instantly. She hurried to the observation window, expecting to find the gorilla sick or collapsed. Instead, Bruno was awake and sitting near the underground maintenance grate built into the far corner of the habitat floor. He was not pacing, not growling, not guarding Daniel's badge anymore. He was listening. Olivia stood perfectly still. The silverback had tilted his head slightly toward the metal grate while one hand rested flat against the concrete floor beside it. Every few seconds, Bruno lightly tapped the ground twice with his knuckles. Then he paused and listened again. Tap, tap, silence. Tap, tap, silence. It was so deliberate that Olivia immediately felt uneasy. "Bruno," she whispered softly. The gorilla turned toward her for only a second before looking back down at the floor grate. Olivia slowly entered the keeper corridor carrying his breakfast tray. The moment the service door unlocked, Bruno backed away calmly instead of blocking the entrance like before. That alone was unusual enough to make her nervous. It almost felt like the gorilla wanted her closer to the grate. Olivia carefully stepped inside the protected feeding area, separated by steel bars, and glanced down at the concrete floor. At first, she saw nothing except damp footprints from overnight cleaning crews. Then something caught her attention near the edge of the drain cover. A thin black streak. She crouched lower. The mark looked greasy, almost like fresh machine oil smeared across the floor. Olivia frowned immediately because no maintenance work was scheduled anywhere near the gorilla habitat that week. She reached toward the grate and suddenly froze. Faintly, almost impossible to hear, came a dull metallic vibration somewhere below the floor. Not pipes, not thunder. It sounded rhythmic, mechanical. Olivia slowly looked back toward Bruno. The giant silverback was watching her carefully now, breathing faster than before. Tap, tap. He struck the floor twice again. Olivia's pulse quickened. "What are you trying to show me?" she whispered under her breath. Before she could investigate further, a loud voice echoed from the hallway behind her. "Do not enter the enclosure unsupervised again." Director Hayes stepped into the corridor, holding transport paperwork in one hand and a tranquilizer schedule in the other. Olivia quickly stood up. Hayes barely glanced toward the grate before focusing on Bruno. "The transfer team arrives tomorrow morning," he announced coldly. "Sedation begins tonight." Bruno immediately reacted to the director's voice. The silverback rose to his feet and moved directly between Hayes and the floor grate, his massive body blocking the entire corner of the habitat. But this time there was no aggression in his posture. No roaring. No threat display. It almost looked protective. Hayes narrowed his eyes. "See," he muttered. "Obsessive territorial behavior." Olivia looked back toward the faint oil streak near the drain cover. Something about the timing felt wrong. The broken camera. The underground noise. Bruno repeatedly guarding the service tunnel. None of it matched the explanation everyone wanted to believe. As Hayes walked away discussing transport logistics over his radio, Olivia remained staring at the floor grate while Bruno slowly lowered himself beside it again. Then the gorilla did something that made the hair rise along the back of her neck. Very carefully, Bruno reached one finger beneath the metal edge of the drain cover and slid out a folded piece of paper covered in dirt and grease. Olivia stared at the grease-covered paper in Bruno's hand, while the giant silverback watched her with an intensity that no longer felt random. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she slowly stepped closer to the steel divider. "Easy," she whispered softly. Bruno did not retreat this time. Instead, he carefully slid the folded paper across the concrete floor toward her with the tips of his fingers. The movement was slow and deliberate, almost cautious, as if he understood the paper mattered. Olivia hesitated before picking it up. The sheet was damp, stained black with oil, and partially torn along one edge. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than maintenance paperwork. But the moment she unfolded it, her stomach dropped. It was not maintenance paperwork at all. It was a shipping manifest. Several lines were smeared beyond recognition, but one section remained clear enough to read. Primate Transfer Authorization. Destination, North River Biomedical Research Facility. Olivia blinked hard, certain she had read it wrong. Westbrook Wildlife Center never transferred animals to research facilities. Especially not Bruno. Her eyes moved lower across the page. Sedation schedule. Private transport clearance. Subject behavioral risk level elevated. Then she saw Daniel's signature at the bottom of the document. No, not a signature. A handwritten note scrawled across the paper in thick black marker. "This is wrong. Do not move him." Olivia's breath caught instantly. Suddenly, every strange thing from the past 2 days crashed together in her mind all at once. Daniel being fired without warning. The hidden paperwork. The disabled camera near the underground tunnel. Bruno guarding the service corridor. The silverback had not been acting unstable. He had been trying to stop something. "Oh my God," Olivia whispered. Bruno let out a low rumbling sound from deep in his chest, not aggressive, not angry. Relieved, as if he finally knew someone understood. Olivia quickly scanned the rest of the page. Another line near the bottom mentioned transport preparation through the underground loading tunnels beneath Habitat 3. That explained the oil streaks, the mechanical noises, the hidden movement below the floor. Someone had already been preparing Bruno's transfer in secret, while publicly claiming he only needed temporary behavioral evaluation. Olivia's hands trembled as she looked back at the gorilla. You knew, she whispered in disbelief. Bruno slowly turned his head toward the underground grate again. Then he tapped the concrete floor twice with his knuckles. Tap, tap, the exact same rhythm from before. Not random behavior. A warning. At that exact moment, loud voices suddenly echoed through the service hallway outside the enclosure. Olivia shoved the paper beneath her clipboard just as Director Hayes entered alongside two men wearing dark transport jackets with facility logos stitched across their chests. One carried a silver equipment case. The other held a tranquilizer rifle. We are moving ahead tonight, Hayes announced sharply. The weather cleared earlier than expected. Olivia's heart pounded. She glanced toward Bruno. The silverback had gone completely still again, watching every movement in the hallway with terrifying focus. One of the transport men looked toward the enclosure and frowned. That animal has been agitated for 48 hours straight, he asked. Hayes nodded. Unpredictable behavior escalation, he replied coldly. We cannot risk public exposure if something happens. Olivia almost spoke immediately, but stopped herself. If Hayes realized she had seen the paperwork, she had no idea what he might do next. Instead, she quietly stepped backward while the men discussed sedation procedures near the keeper door. Bruno's breathing grew heavier. But instead of reacting to the rifle or strangers, the gorilla stared directly at the silver equipment case resting beside the transport worker's boots. Olivia noticed it then. A small yellow sticker attached to the side of the case. North River Biomedical. The exact same name printed on the hidden transfer paper. Her blood ran cold. This was never a behavioral transfer. Bruno had known from the beginning. That was why he guarded the tunnels. Why he hid Daniel's badge. Why he kept trying to stop staff from entering the underground corridor. He was not afraid for himself. He was trying to warn them that Daniel had been telling the truth before he disappeared. Olivia slowly turned toward the silverback again. Bruno was already looking directly at her. Not confused. Not aggressive. Just waiting. Waiting for a human to finally understand. And for the first time since Daniel had been fired, Olivia realized the entire zoo had been wrong about the gorilla. Olivia could barely breathe as the truth settled over her like ice water. Every frightening moment from the past 2 days suddenly transformed into something heartbreaking. Bruno had never tried to scare anyone. He had been trying to stop them. The silverback remained seated beside the underground grate while the transport workers continued discussing sedation doses only a few feet away. Completely unaware that the gorilla they called unstable had spent 48 straight hours desperately trying to protect himself from disappearing forever. Olivia looked down at the grease-stained paper hidden beneath her clipboard again and felt shame twist painfully in her chest. She remembered Bruno dragging the blanket in front of the keeper door. She remembered him touching the glass where Daniel used to place his hand every morning. She remembered the untouched food, the pacing, the strange tapping against the floor, the emergency alarms, the careful piles of straw near the sprinkler system. None of it had been random. The gorilla had been trying to prepare for something terrible while every human around him called him dangerous. Across the hallway, one of the transport workers opened the silver equipment case and began organizing syringes. The metallic clicking sound echoed softly through the corridor. Bruno immediately lowered his head and wrapped one arm around Daniel's employee badge again. Olivia's throat tightened at the sight. It looked less like an animal holding an object and more like someone clinging to the last proof that they had once mattered to another living soul. Director Hayes continued speaking with the transfer crew without even looking toward the enclosure. We move him before sunrise, he said firmly. Minimal public attention. Minimal complications. Olivia stared at him in disbelief. Minimal complications. As if Bruno were cargo instead of a living creature who had understood exactly what was happening before any human did. Suddenly, she remembered something Daniel once told her during a veterinary checkup months earlier. Bruno hated closed trailers. When he was rescued as a baby, traffickers had transported him across state lines inside a cramped shipping container for nearly 2 days before authorities intercepted the vehicle. Daniel believed the trauma never fully left him. At the time, Olivia thought it was just another emotional story from an overly attached keeper. But now her stomach turned with horror. Bruno had recognized the signs immediately. The hidden tunnels, the equipment, the transport crew. The silverback had not been reacting to Daniel leaving. He had been reacting to being taken away again. Olivia slowly approached the observation glass while the others remained distracted behind her. Bruno looked up the moment she stopped in front of him. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The giant silverback simply watched her with exhausted eyes that no longer looked angry at all. They looked betrayed. Olivia pressed her trembling hand gently against the glass. "I am so sorry," she whispered. Bruno slowly lifted his own hand and placed it against the opposite side. The size difference between them felt overwhelming. One small human hand. One enormous gray-black palm scarred from years inside captivity. Yet at that moment, the gorilla's touch felt strangely fragile. Olivia felt tears burn behind her eyes because she suddenly realized Bruno had spent 2 days begging humans to listen while everyone treated him like a threat. Behind her, one of the transport workers loaded a tranquilizer dart with a sharp metallic snap. Bruno flinched instantly at the sound. Not violently, fearfully. The reaction shattered something inside Olivia. "Stop," she said suddenly, turning around. The hallway fell quiet. Hayes frowned. "Excuse me." Olivia stepped protectively closer to the enclosure. "You cannot sedate him tonight." Hayes' expression hardened immediately. "This decision has already been approved." "Then the board approved it based on lies," Olivia replied. The room went silent. Even the transport workers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Olivia pulled the grease-stained document from beneath her clipboard and held it tightly in her shaking hands. "Bruno was never unstable," she said quietly. "He was trying to warn us." Hayes' face drained of color the moment he recognized the transfer paper. For the first time since Daniel's firing, the director looked genuinely nervous. Meanwhile, inside Habitat 3, Bruno remained beside the glass with one hand resting softly against it, watching Olivia with the cautious hope of someone who had almost given up believing anybody would finally understand. And as thunder rumbled faintly beyond the zoo walls, Olivia made a decision that could cost her career. She was going to find Daniel before sunrise. Rain still clung to the zoo pathways when Olivia finally found Daniel sitting alone inside a 24-hour diner nearly 5 miles from Westbrook Wildlife Center. The former keeper looked exhausted, his wrinkled uniform jacket folded beside a half-finished cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes as if he had not slept since being fired. When Olivia rushed into the booth and placed the grease-stained transfer document in front of him, Daniel stared at the paper for several silent seconds before lowering his head into his hands. "I tried to stop them," he whispered hoarsely. Olivia slid into the seat across from him. "Why did you not tell anyone?" Daniel gave a weak laugh, filled with disbelief. "Who would believe me over the zoo director?" he asked quietly. Then his expression shifted the moment Olivia mentioned Bruno's behavior. The untouched food, the emergency alarms, the hidden badge, the tapping against the underground grate. Daniel's eyes slowly filled with emotion. "He remembered," he murmured. Olivia frowned slightly. "Remembered what?" Daniel looked out the rain-covered diner window for a moment before answering. "The sound." Olivia sat completely still while Daniel explained what happened years earlier after Bruno was rescued from traffickers as a frightened young gorilla. During transport between facilities, workers used to bang metal bars twice against the shipping container before sedating the animals inside. Tap, tap, every single time. Daniel had spent years helping Bruno overcome panic around enclosed spaces and underground transport tunnels. But somehow, after seeing the hidden transfer equipment and hearing movement beneath the zoo, Bruno recognized the pattern all over again. He knew they were coming for him. Olivia felt tears sting her eyes as she imagined the giant silverback sitting alone in the enclosure, trying desperately to warn humans about a fear buried deep in his memory. Not because he hated people, because he trusted one human enough to believe someone might still save him. Daniel grabbed his jacket immediately. "We have to get back before sunrise," he said. By the time they returned to Westbrook Wildlife Center, pale morning light had begun creeping across the sky. Transport vehicles already waited near the underground loading corridor behind Habitat 3. Olivia's heart pounded as she and Daniel hurried through the service entrance. Inside the enclosure building, Bruno sat exactly where Olivia had left him beside the glass, clutching the employee badge carefully between both hands. The moment Daniel stepped into the hallway, the silverback froze completely. No roaring, no charging, no pounding against the walls. Bruno simply stared at him with stunned disbelief, almost as if he thought he was imagining it. Daniel slowly approached the observation window while every nearby employee watched in silence. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. The sound of his voice changed everything instantly. Bruno's shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. The giant gorilla slowly rose to his feet and walked toward the glass with cautious steps, never taking his eyes off Daniel. But instead of pressing against the window or becoming frantic, Bruno did something that made several staff members quietly wipe tears from their faces. He carefully placed Daniel's employee badge down on the concrete floor between them. Then he stepped backward. Olivia realized what the gesture meant before anyone else did. Bruno was giving it back. The silverback no longer needed to guard the last piece of Daniel he had left because Daniel had returned. Daniel knelt beside the glass, overwhelmed with emotion. "You kept trying to tell us," he whispered shakily. Bruno lowered himself onto the floor directly across from him, his breathing finally slow and calm again. The transport workers stood frozen nearby, uncertain what to do next. Even Director Hayes looked shaken now. The difference in Bruno was impossible to ignore. The terrified pacing was gone. The tension was gone. For the first time since Daniel's firing, Habitat 3 felt peaceful again. Olivia quietly stepped toward the control panel beside the hallway door. One by one, she shut down the transport authorization systems connected to the underground loading tunnel. Red status lights faded dark across the monitor screens. No sedation. No transfer. No transport route. Nothing. Daniel looked up at her in surprise. Olivia smiled faintly through watery eyes. "He already spent 2 days trying to save himself," she said softly. "He should not have to fight anymore." Inside the enclosure, Bruno slowly leaned back against the concrete wall while soft morning sunlight spilled through the Habitat windows onto the floor around him. For the first time in nearly 48 hours, the silverback finally closed his eyes and rested. 3 months later, visitors arriving at Westbrook Wildlife Center noticed something different the moment they reached Habitat 3. The loud warning signs and temporary security barriers were gone. In their place stood a simple bronze plaque mounted beside the viewing glass. Most people paused to read it before stepping closer to the enclosure. The plaque did not mention the investigation, the canceled transfer, or the scandal that forced Director Hayes to resign weeks after internal records became public. It did not mention the hidden contracts or the underground loading tunnel either. Instead, the plaque carried only one sentence beneath a small photograph of Bruno sitting beside Daniel on a rainy morning years earlier. Some voices do not use words, but they still deserve to be heard. Families often stood quietly after reading it. Some parents explained the story softly to their children, while others simply stared through the glass toward the massive silverback resting peacefully beneath the indoor skylight. Bruno had changed since Daniel returned. The nervous pacing disappeared completely. The emergency alarms never sounded again. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., visitors could hear the familiar two-note whistle echo gently through the Habitat corridor before Daniel stepped inside, carrying breakfast trays. And every morning without fail, Bruno answered with the same deep rumbling sound from across the enclosure. The entire zoo had begun timing their mornings by it. Even employees from other exhibits stopped to listen sometimes. Olivia noticed something else had changed too. Bruno no longer guarded the underground grate. Weeks earlier, maintenance crews permanently sealed the tunnel entrance connected to Habitat 3 after investigators uncovered hidden transfer preparations below the building. On the day the concrete was poured shut, Bruno sat quietly beside Daniel watching the workers from across the Habitat. At one point, the silverback slowly walked over to the sealed floor and placed his hand against the fresh concrete for several seconds before turning away for good. It was the last time anyone ever saw him check the tunnel. Daniel eventually returned to work officially, though he refused every promotion the zoo offered afterward. He stayed exactly where he wanted to be beside Bruno. Sometimes during slower afternoons, visitors spotted Daniel sitting near the glass reading aloud from old paperback novels while Bruno listened calmly nearby with his eyes half closed. Not performing, not entertaining crowds, just listening. The videos recorded during the frightening days before the canceled transfer continued spreading online for months. Millions of people watched clips of Bruno dragging the blanket across the keeper door, protecting Daniel's badge, and tapping against the floor grate while trying desperately to warn humans around him. But strangely, the clip that touched people most was only 7 seconds long. It showed Bruno on the morning Daniel returned quietly, placing the employee badge onto the concrete floor before stepping back. No aggression, no drama, just trust. Schools began using the story in animal behavior classes. Veterinary students wrote papers about trauma memory in rescued primates. Donations poured into the zoo's rehabilitation programs for trafficked animals. But inside Habitat 3, none of that seemed to matter much to Bruno. The silverback appeared happiest during the quietest moments. Early mornings before visitors arrived. Rainy afternoons when thunder rolled softly outside. Evenings when Daniel stayed late cleaning enrichment toys while humming old country songs under his breath. One cold autumn evening, Olivia stopped by the Habitat after closing time and found Bruno sitting beside the glass watching orange leaves drift across the empty pathways outside. Daniel stood nearby preparing to lock the keeper gate for the night. "You know," Olivia said quietly, "I still cannot believe he understood what they were planning." Daniel looked toward Bruno for a long moment before answering. "I think he understood something even bigger," he said softly. Olivia frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Daniel smiled sadly while Bruno rested one massive hand against the window beside him. "He knew the difference between people who cared about him," Daniel replied, "and people who only wanted control." Outside the Habitat, the last visitors of the evening slowly disappeared into the fading light, while Bruno remained peacefully beside the glass, no longer guarding doors or tunnels or hidden papers. He did not need to anymore. Someone had finally listened. And sometimes, being understood is the thing that saves us.